Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I welcome all the Emojis members who have logged in for today's webinar. I also welcome all the speakers who have
Madam,
come
shall we
here.
start?
We have started, no, Sushma. I welcome all the speakers for today's webinar. See, as you know, we cannot conduct the academic activities as usual because of this COVID. And today, this month, the November month is also recognized as the preterm prematurity awareness month. So I think it is the responsibility of all the obstetricians to create awareness among all the pregnant women to take prophylaxis or to prevent prematurity. Because you all know the social and the economical burden because of prematurity and also the mental agony when they deliver before term. And also, today we will know the importance of fosfomycin in pregnancy, and also the management of endometriosis, which is the more confusing and controversy. At the same time, I also pray God so that the COVID-19 pandemic will get over soon, and we can go back to the usual routine life without any fear. And once again, I welcome all the Emojis members and all the speakers. Thank you. I think we can start. Sushma?
No, madam. Sushma, madam, connectivity lost.
How? No. I think we can go ahead with the first talk.
Madam, you can hand over to speaker. Madam, you can hand over to speaker, I think.
Okay. I think the first talk is by Dr.
I'm audible?
Dr.
Yes,
Harsha.
madam. No audible.
We can go ahead with the first talk.
Yeah, thank you, madam. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Shriyar Shajur, consultant urologist practicing in Bangalore Apollo Hospital. So,
Start ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ at least ನಾನು ವೆಲ್ಕ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬಿಡ್ತೀನಿ.
can you see my screen?
Shall I?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can see your slides.
Good afternoon, Dr. Shri Harsha.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Hello?
Yeah, please continue, sir. Please continue.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Shriyar Shajur. So today I'm going to talk about fosfomycin in pregnancy, role of fosfomycin and UTI complications. Though UTI complications is very vast subject, I'm going to give some snippets which are useful in day-to-day practice. So coming to the classification of UTI, we classify UTI into different categories. The first one is uncomplicated UTI, which is quite commonly we see in OPD, day-to-day OPDs. So the young female less than 40 years are without any comorbidities. So if they come with urinary tract infection, we call it as uncomplicated UTI, and rest all comes under complicated UTI, like UTI in men, pregnant women, patients with relevant anatomical and functional abnormalities, or with comorbidities like diabetes, renal diseases. And next one is recurrent UTI. Recurrent UTI, so once female crosses 50 years, this is the most common problem. And we classify recurrent UTI in, we call it as recurrent UTI when a female experience 3 episodes or more in a single year, or at least 2 episodes in last 6 months. Another one is catheter associated UTI. We categorized into catheter associated UTI when UTI happens within 48 hours of catheterization or catheter removal. Next one is urosepsis. This is the most dangerous infection, and when urine infection spreads systemically and involves multi-organ or causes multi-organ dysfunction, we call it as urosepsis. So coming to the UTI in pregnancy. So based on researchers, around 17 to 18% of women will have urinary tract infection. In that, 13% will be asymptomatic. So what are the predisposing factors which causes UTI in pregnancy? One is increased blood volume, that is secondary to detrusor muscle tone, and ureteric dilatation, which causes a reflux into the kidney and which helps in spread of the infection to kidney, causing pyelonephritis, and physiological aminoaciduria and glycosuria, and sexual activity during pregnancy, and difficulty keeping hygiene because of distended and gravid abdomen, increased age and lower socioeconomic group, and concomitant urinary tract anomalies are with comorbidities like diabetes and sickle cell disease. So these are the organisms which causes urinary tract infection in pregnancy. The most common will be E. coli, and second most common is Staphylococcus. So what are the presentations of urinary tract infection in pregnancy? One is asymptomatic bacteriuria, and another one is systemic infection, which symptomatic infection, which is cystitis and pyelonephritis. Coming to asymptomatic bacteriuria in adults, we call it as asymptomatic bacteriuria when we diagnosed urinary tract infection in urine culture, that is midstream sample, and if colony count is more than 10 to the power of 5, and 2 consecutive samples in women and 1 sample in men. So in catheterized patient, we call it as asymptomatic bacteriuria when bacterial count is 10 to the power of 2 colony forming units. So is the treatment of asymptomatic bacteriuria is beneficial in pregnant women or not? So if you don't treat asymptomatic bacteriuria, the chance of cystitis will be up to 30%, and it can cause pyelonephritis up to 50%, which lead to preterm delivery and preterm babies. And coming to adverse effects on the babies, it can cause prematurity, low birth weight, and increased prenatal mortality. So pregnant women should be screened and treated for asymptomatic bacteriuria. So screen it in first antenatal visit and in subsequent visits. These are the empirical antibiotics we use in UTI: nitrofurantoin, amoxicillin, cephalexin, fosfomycin, and trimethoprim. So nitrofurantoin should be avoided in G6PD deficiencies, and trimethoprim in first trimester and sulfamethoxazole in third trimester. Recent addition is the fosfomycin. It's a single dose 3-gram oral powder, which we are going to discuss now. And in recurrent UTI in pregnancy, so diabetes and sickle cell triads are the most common predisposing factors for recurrent UTIs. So to diagnose recurrent UTI, or when you're suspecting UTI, you should repeat the culture 1 week after completing the antibiotics and monthly subsequently till the completion of pregnancy. So what are the indications for prophylaxis in pregnancy? Prophylaxis is needed when patient is having recurrent UTI pre-pregnancy, or persistent symptom or asymptomatic bacteriuria after 2 courses of antibiotics, and after 1 episode of UTI in case of diabetes or sickle cell triad. These are the limitations while using day-to-day antibiotic, which we are using till now. So one is longer duration of therapy, which at least 3 to 7 days. So already patient will be the patient will be apprehensive to take a long duration of antibiotics when there are no symptoms. You diagnose it in the first visit and you tell that you're having infection and to take antibiotic for 3 to 7 days. They may not continue that in fear of drug affecting the baby. So another one is emergence of multi-drug resistant organisms. So international guidelines recommends nowadays fosfomycin single dose therapy. In Infectious Disease Society of America and Urological Society, European Association of Urology recommends fosfomycin in pregnancy. Rationale for fosfomycin in UTI. So resistance of common urinary pathogens to antibiotic is on rise. So fosfomycin is promising option in multi-drug resistant pathogens. Currently, there is no single day oral therapy for uncomplicated UTI. And fosfomycin offers effective single dose therapy. Fosfomycin was discovered in 1969. It's a broad spectrum antibiotic. There is no cross resistance till now. It can be administered in combination with number of other antimicrobial agents. It's a unique antibiotic, no structural relationship with other known classes of agents. Belongs to a class of phosphonic antibiotics. So mechanism of action, it's a bactericidal drug. It inactivates the enzyme, which helps in bacterial wall synthesis, reduces adherence of bacteria to uroepithelial cells, generally no cross resistance, and unique mechanism of action is lack of structural similarities. So it prevents biofilm formation. So it inhibits the biofilm formation, penetrates the biofilm formation, and disrupts biofilm killing sessile cells. So it reduces the resistance by inhibiting the fimbrial function and also biofilm formation. Approval status worldwide, it is US FDA approved 3 gram single dose therapy and also approved in various European countries. Microbiology, it covers most of the bacteria's aerobic gram-positive microorganisms, aerobic gram-negative microorganisms. It achieves a single dose achieves urinary concentration higher than MICs of common uropathogens within 4 hours, and it's sustained for 36 to 48 hours. Metabolism, it is not at all metabolized inside the body. It excreted unchanged in urine and feces, achieves high urinary concentration. In renal impairment, the excretion will be prolonged. So preparation, so it should be prepared by mixing 1 sachet of 3 grams in 1 glass of water. Don't use hot water, and it should be consumed immediately. Never tell the patient consume with powder as such. In case of overdose, patient may experience vestibular loss, hearing impairment, metallic taste, and generally the treatment is symptomatic. So these are the most common side effects we see when we prescribe fosfomycin. One is nausea, another one is diarrhea, dyspnea, and dizziness. I have come across diarrhea as a most common side effect. Better to prescribe probiotic along with fosfomycin, or when patient, you should warn the patient regarding diarrhea. If diarrhea starts, then we can prescribe probiotics. So sensitivity of fosfomycin in the studies done in India shows almost 100% sensitivity for E. coli compared to 84% in nitrofurantoin. So fosfomycin has emerged as a promising option, especially in cases involving multi-drug resistant pathogens in which previous antibiotics have failed to cure the infection. So fosfomycin demonstrated 100% sensitivity in case of Staphylococcus. It may be MRSA, coagulate negative Staphylococcus, methicillin resistant, Enterococcus, vancomycin resistant, and Streptococcus species. So in one more Indian study, the fosfomycin showed almost 92 to 90% of sensitivity for Enterobacteriaceae family. Fosfomycin susceptibility is almost 97 for Pseudomonas, 96% for ESBL producing organisms, and 91% for MBL, 96% gram-positive isolates, and 88% for MRSA. So the role of fosfomycin in pregnancy. European Association of Urology included fosfomycin in their guidelines as a first line of empirical antibiotic in pregnancy-associated infection, urinary infection. They have declared it as a category B drug in pregnancy. In different clinical studies, fosfomycin has been evaluated for UTI treatment during pregnancy. Fosfomycin is safe and is well tolerated. So these are some of the evidences which shows benefit of fosfomycin. So this is a meta-analysis which confirmed the effectiveness of fosfomycin in uncomplicated UTI and asymptomatic bacteriuria. This is one more study from Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. This recommends first choice drug for uncomplicated lower tract infection in pregnancy. This fosfomycin can be used in case of recurrent urinary tract infection. So Canadian Association of Urology and European Association of Urology recommends 3 grams sachet every 10 days for 3 to 6 months. In summary, it exerts a powerful bactericidal activity both against gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria. Resistant rates relatively stable over time. Bactericidal agent with unique mechanism of action, less likely to cross resistant. And more than 90% of UPAC causes uncomplicated UTI were susceptible to fosfomycin, irrespective of ESBL production. And significantly better result regarding microbiological success, established efficacy and safety with single dose therapy, similar to 3 days or 7 days regimens, and can be effective treatment modality in women more than 18 years of age with acute uncomplicated UTI. So this is about fosfomycin. And coming to complications of UTI, it's a vast subject. I'm just going to discuss about day-to-day problems we're facing on day-to-day OPD or IPD patients. So first important thing is how to collect the urine sample properly. So you should instruct the patient to collect urine sample with the spread of the labia and wash or cleanse the periurethral area with 2% castile soap tolate, and then collect the midstream urine specimen. So complications of UTI these are some of the most common complications we encounter. It may lead to cystitis, symptomatic cystitis, recurrent UTI, infected hydronephrosis and pyonephrosis, pyelonephritis, renal abscess, chronic pyelonephritis, and emphysematous pyelonephritis and urosepsis. So though we diagnose urine infection by urine culture, sometimes routinely patients will go for urine test, urine microscopy, or we advise urine microscopy, and the pus cells will be high, then we'll advise culture. And if culture comes positive, it is not necessary that everyone should be treated with antibiotics. These are some of the exceptions where we are not supposed to treat it. First one is women without any risk factor. It is not necessary to treat it unless they have symptoms. Next, patients with well-regulated diabetes mellitus. If a diabetic patient, if sugars are absolutely controlled and they are regularly monitoring and they don't have symptoms, and it's not necessary to treat asymptomatic bacteriuria. Next is post-menopausal woman. Then also, if patient is not symptomatic, you should not treat it. In elderly institutionalized patients in old age homes, if urine culture comes positive, if they have done accidentally or without any symptoms, then it doesn't require treatment. And patients with dysfunctional or reconstructed lower urinary tract, if we see asymptomatic bacteriuria still, we don't treat it. And patients with prior to arthroplasty surgeries, where a patient is going for knee replacement, then urine culture comes positive, then European Association of Urology doesn't recommend any antibiotic or treating that infection. On contrary, we should treat when we see asymptomatic bacteriuria in pregnant women who are undergoing urological procedures where we are going to breach the mucosa, urothelial mucosa. These are the risk factor we should evaluate, or we should think about when you are evaluating the UTI or when you are taking the history for UTI. We should know about reduced urine flow, the factor causing promote colonization and facilitate ascent. The reduced urine flow, then if someone is coming for recurrent UTI first time, you may not give importance to these factors. When it comes second time or third time, then evaluate thoroughly with these things in your mind. Reduced urine flow like outflow obstruction, stricture urethra, neurogenic bladder, or inadequate water intake, which factors which promote colonization like sexual activity, use of spermicide, estrogen depletion, or antimicrobial agents, or which facilitates the ascent like catheterization, urinary incontinence, fecal incontinence, residual urine with ischemia of bladder wall. Coming to the uncomplicated UTI, where patient is symptomatic, then first thing is focused history taking. And then we should rule out pelvic inflammatory disease, absence of vaginal discharge and irritation. If at all it is there, the prime importance is to treat vaginal infection rather than urine infection. So in terms of in treating uncomplicated UTI, the first choice should be fosfomycin or nitrofurantoin. Don't use aminopenicillin or fluoroquinolones to treat uncomplicated cystitis, where if patient, it's quite common that Norflox is designated to urinary tract infection. So stop using Norflox or Levoflox or Ciplox as a first line treatment for uncomplicated UTI. Fosfomycin is very useful. Just single dose should be fine for uncomplicated UTI in young females. Nitrofurantoin is still useful. These two are specifically reserved for urinary tract infection. So almost 90 to 100% of bacteria are sensitive to these two antibiotics. So in recurrent UTI, these are the predisposing factors. When you're taking history in young or premenopausal women, then ask about sexual intercourse, the gap between sexual intercourse, different partners, and use of spermicide while having intercourse, and when they start new sexual partner, or a mother with history of UTI or history of UTI during childhood. When it comes to postmenopausal elderly women, so as the history of UTI during or before menopause, urinary incontinence, if patient is having stress incontinence, that will help in ascent of the bacteria and it causes urinary infection, recurrent infection. Check for atrophic vaginitis due to estrogen deficiency, examine for cystocele, and increased post-void urine. Get an ultrasound scan to check the post-void residue, and ask about urine catheterization and deterioration in elderly institutionalized women. So the recommendation to prevent recurrent urine infection or infection in recurrent urinary tract infection, so diagnose the recurrent urinary tract infection by urine culture. Don't go by just by symptoms. The patient may say, I'm having same symptoms, burning sensation and all. Just try to rule out other causes of dysuria, like decreased water intake, interstitial cystitis. Second, do not perform an extensive routine workup like cystoscopy, full abdomen ultrasound in women younger than 40 years of age, where there is no risk factor. I have seen a lot of urologists or gynecologists recommending for cystoscopy and dilatation or VAU in young females, which is absolutely not necessary, which will lead to scarring and recurrent strictures, which is very difficult to treat. And don't perform any cystoscopy when in an uncomplicated UTI in young female. Advise patients on behavioral modification, which might reduce the risk of recurrent UTI. Behavioral modification in water intake, or avoiding after sexual intercourse, or how to use commode. Indian females are not used to commodes with hygiene. It is made for Westerners. So educate the females how to use commode. Indians use a lot of water, which itself will help in spread of the infection. And always tell them to wipe from anterior to posterior, never from backward to front, and avoid jets using jets from behind, from backwards to front. Use of vaginal estrogen replacement in postmenopausal women will help in preventing recurrent UTI and also the symptomatic relief. So only this is recommended by European Association of Urology. And use immunoactive prophylaxis to reduce recurrent UTI in all age group. Uvexome, still I have not used, but guidelines have recommended Uvexome to prevent recurrent urinary tract infection. Use continuous or postcoital antimicrobial prophylaxis to prevent recurrent UTI in sexually active females. And for patients with good compliance, self-administered short-term antimicrobial therapy should be considered. So we can tell some educated, compliant patient regarding self-start medication, when they are getting repeated infection, when after 2-3 episodes, they will come to know when they are having infection. Tell them to give an urine culture and then start the medication, short course medicines like phosphophosphorol 1 sachets they can take, or nitrofurantoin they can start till they get a urine culture report, or empirically for 3 days. So low dose prophylaxis for long period or post-coital prophylaxis, as both regimens reduce the rate of recurrent UTI. The prophylaxis we can continue up to 3 to 6 months. So these are the regimens we use to reduce recurrent infections by giving low dose prophylaxis. So nitrofurantoin 50 or 100 milligram, fosfomycin for 3 grams every 10 days, trimethoprim 100 milligram once daily. In pregnancy, we can use cephalexin or cefaclor. Post-coital prophylaxis should be considered in pregnant women with history of frequent UTI before onset of pregnancy. In first antenatal visit, if they are sexually active and during pregnancy, and if she's having recurrent UTI before getting pregnant, then advise post-coital prophylaxis. So next big complication is pyelonephritis. Whenever someone comes with urinary tract symptoms or without urinary tract symptoms with fevers and chills, and you are suspecting urinary tract infection, even though in the absence of typical symptoms of cystitis, so you should consider pyelonephritis. Early diagnosis is very important. Pyelonephritis, which will prevent hospitalization or ICU admission or multi-organ failure later. You should consider definitely in diabetic female who are having chills and rigors and flank pain. So these are the typical signs and symptoms of pyelonephritis. One is high-grade fever, chills, flank pain, nausea, vomiting, and renal angle tenderness with or without typical symptoms of cystitis. So when you suspect pyelonephritis, treat the patient. If symptoms are very mild, treat the patient with oral antibiotics for 72 hours. If symptoms are not resolving, then go for a contrast enhanced CT scan of KUB if renal functions are normal. Or if patient condition is not good in the first visit itself, then immediately go for contrast CT. In pregnant women, you can go for ultrasound scan or MRI. Fluoroquinolones and cephalosporins are the first line drug to be used during as an empirical treatment for pyelonephritis. And once we get the urine culture report, then according to that, we can change over to other antibiotics. So carbapenem should be reserved only for multi-drug resistant organisms. Do not use nitrofurantoin or fosfomycin in case of pyelonephritis. It should be used only in uncomplicated UTI or asymptomatic bacteriuria. This doesn't have tissue penetration, so you should not use this nitrofurantoin or fosfomycin when you are suspecting pyelonephritis. So these are the drugs we commonly use in uncomplicated pyelonephritis. So the duration of treatment should be minimum 2 weeks. We give up to 2 to 3 weeks. Initially, IV antibiotics till the fever subsides or symptomatically better, then switch over to oral antibiotics for 2 to 3 weeks. This is the most dangerous complication of UTI, emphysematous pyelonephritis. If you are suspecting a pyelonephritis in diabetic patient, immediately go for a CT scan just to diagnose. One thing is emphysematous pyelonephritis, another one is stone blocking the kidney tubes or ureters. So this emphysematous pyelonephritis is a urological emergency characterized by necrotizing parenchymal or perirenal infection caused by gas-forming uropathogens. When you see the CT, if you find a gas inside the kidney or surrounding the kidney or in the ureter, you should suspect emphysematous pyelonephritis. And the mortality is very high. It is around 19 to 43%. Immediately surgical intervention is required in terms of nephrectomy, removal of the kidney or drainage of the pus. So next most important or most common situation we encounter in day-to-day practice or in the hospital wards is catheter-associated UTI. So we call it as catheter-associated urinary tract infection if patient develop signs of UTI, or we diagnose as UTI within 48 hours of catheterization, urinary catheterization, or within 48 hours after removing the Foley's catheter. So in catheter associated UTI, take the urine culture prior starting the antibiotics. Do not carry out routine urine culture in asymptomatic catheterized patient. Urine culture is not necessary when patient is asymptomatic. And where routinely some people will do urine microscopy, they find pus cells, and then they do this one culture. And first of all, the asymptomatic pyuria doesn't require any antibiotic treatment in catheterized patient. Without infection also, they can have pyuria. And just by seeing the Foley's catheter, the cloudy urine or some cotton deposits, don't treat it as an urinary tract infection. Or replace or remove the catheter once you start antimicrobial. Remove the catheter once you are treating symptomatic UTI. When you are decided to treat the UTI, remove the catheter, or if it is mandatory, just replace the catheter. Do not apply any topical antiseptics or antimicrobial to the catheter, urethra, or meatus. There is no need to clean with betadine or sulfamycin or mupirocin the catheter daily. Do not use prophylactic antimicrobials. So prophylactic medicines are not necessary when someone is on Foley's catheter, just to prevent infection. So next most important or needed is the urosepsis. Once you diagnose urosepsis, then you have to involve urologist, intensivist, physician, and infectious disease team. In urosepsis, urologist involvement is important. If the kidney is blocked, the most common thing is papillary necrosis, which will come and block the kidney tube ureters and causing hydronephrosis and persistent pyelonephritis, where in spite of antibiotics, if patient is not improving or it's not showing the signs of decreased infection, then we may have to put a degestant, or we may drain the urine from the kidney by nephrostomy. The most important things are papillary necrosis and ureteric stone, which causing urosepsis and leading to multi-organ dysfunction. So this is about infection in snippets. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Harsha. That was a very elaborative discussion on the topic of UTI in pregnancy. Indeed, it was very much
Madam, kindly unmute yourself, Sushma Madam. I have sent a request. Again, we lost Sushma Madam. Premlata Madam, can you continue?
Yeah, I am back again. Yeah, a lot of disturbance in the network over here. Yeah, we have few questions for Dr. Harsha. Shall we proceed, Dr. Harsha?
Yeah, sure.
The first question is like, what are the contraindications of fosfomycin in pregnancy? Are there any?
In renal, if you are suspecting any renal impairment, then those should be modified. Apart from that, in most of the scenarios, you can give fosfomycin.
Next, what's the clinical safety of fosfomycin in pregnancy? I think the same question will be.
Yeah, it's completely safe. It's not teratogenic. It's a category B drug according to European Association of Urology.
What's your clinical experience with fosfomycin in the day-to-day practice?
Day-to-day practice, I use only two drugs for UTI nowadays. One is nitrofurantoin and fosfomycin. And I prefer fosfomycin as the first-line drug in uncomplicated UTIs.
Right. And yeah, what's your opinion on the treatment of asymptomatic bacteriuria in pregnancy? I think this was discussed again in detail in your presentation.
Yeah, that should be treated without any doubt.
I think
And-
these are the only questions for you, Doctor. Thank you so
Okay.
much. It was really very informative for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll move on to the next discussion, that is on the prevention of preterm labor. I take privilege to invite the speaker, Dr. Ashok Kumar. Can you please share your screen, Dr. Ashok?
Yeah.
To introduce Dr. Ashok Kumar, he is the consultant, fertility specialist, andrologist, and gynecolaparoscopic surgeon. And he's done his diploma in reproductive medicines from Kiel University, Germany, and is trained in male infertility and microsurgery from USA, and also done fellowship in reproductive medicine from Kraft Hospital, Kerala, and also fellowship in advanced laparoscopic and robotic oncology from Galaxy Care. And he was the former head on IVF department in the KIMS Medical College, Tamil Nadu, and former associate professor in the College of Medical Sciences, Nepal. And he's been the managing committee member of Tamil Nadu State Chapter of IAGE, and also the faculty for training advanced laparoscopic courses for Johnson & Johnson and Bloom Fertility Center. He's a member of OGSSI, FOXY, IAGE, TAPISAR and ISAR, and also IMA. We welcome you, Dr. Ashok, on behalf of Mysore Society, and we hand over the discussions for you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Sushma. And I think before I start my talk, I really want to say that, I'm overjoyed today because I passed out from JSS Medical College. Hello, Pramila ma'am. I hope you remember me. How are you, ma'am? Hello. Yeah. So
we can hear you, sir. We can hear you.
yeah. So thank you.
I think ma'am says not been connected.
Okay. So first, before I start my talk, let me first thank the place where I passed out my post-graduation and the place where I started my, obstetrics and gynecology career from JSS. So I don't know if Dr. Ambrish is there, Dr. Rupa ma'am, Anjali ma'am, Nandish sir, Prasad sir, Parvatama ma'am, Pramila ma'am, everybody, Rupa ma'am, all of them. I want to really thank them. So, okay, now let's move on to our talk.
Hello.
Yes,
Ashok.
ma'am.
Oh,
How
you are the
ma'am?
same. I could not recognize you.
I become little fat now, ma'am. I was very thin at that time as a student.
Okay. Thank you for remembering me. If you had not told me, I don't think I would have recognized you.
So that's I know it's I think it's almost 2003-8 batch. I was almost.
Yeah. Along with you, who were there? I mean, I just.
Kavita was there from Kerala. Then
Okay.
Parija was there.
Yeah. Now I got it. Okay. But you
So-
are looking, I don't know. For me, it's my opinion. I cannot recognize you.
I become very fat.
If I see you in close up, I think I might be able to.
So I really-
Then I told your name at the time of welcome speech. At least you could have told me no.
No, I did not want to discontinue in your talk.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank
Continue.
you.
Go ahead with the talk.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, so today, actually, I've been asked to talk on the role of natural micronized progesterone, specifically the oral natural micronized progesterone in the prevention of preterm labor. So I'll be limiting myself in collecting the evidence and probably updating ourselves in knowing what is the present role of progesterone in preventing preterm labor in certain specific conditions. So what I'll be discussing mainly is the definition of preterm labor, but more important is I have put few specific conditions where there is increased chances of preterm, and probably I want to show you what does the evidence say when you supplement progesterone on them, whether you can prevent preterm or no. And in the end, I'll be collecting all the international guidelines on the progesterone in preterm labor and say what is helpful, what is not helpful, and probably few slides on what are the different progesterones available, the route of administration, and which is best out of everything. Okay, now what is more important for us is the preterm labor. We all know that any contraction happening before 37 weeks of gestational age is called as preterm labor. Now, why is it so important for us to discuss today is because The largest number of preterm births happen in India, approximately around 3.5 million per year. And India tops in the preterm labor, where almost around 1 in 10 babies are born earlier. So it's, I'm very sure that every obstetrician will never deny that they don't want to put their baby in the NICU. And we know once the baby goes into NICU, the amount of financial stress, the emotional stress, and the mental stress is enormous. So everybody wants to give a term healthy baby directly to the mother. So these are the different conditions which I have taken, like as I discussed before, and probably we will see whether supplementing progesterone in short cervix prevents preterm, whether supplementing progesterone with history of preterm birth prevents preterm, whether supplementing progesterone in twin gestations will prevent preterm, whether progesterone can be thought as a maintenance tocolysis in patients who already had preterm and successfully arrested them, and can progesterone be equal to or superior to cervical encerclage in preventing preterm? So we know all these conditions are at risk for preterm. Now, only thing we have to answer our patient is what should we intervene so that they don't go into preterm. So let's go to the first condition, that is short cervix. Now, what is this short cervix? Let's make the definition very clear. You should do a transvaginal ultrasound, not a transabdominal ultrasound. Do a transvaginal ultrasound at around 18 to 22 weeks, that is the mid trimester, and look for the cervical length. If the cervical length is less than 2.5 centimeter transvaginally, then you label it as short cervix. This is by default agreed by all the international society. Now, why this cutoff of 2.5 centimeter is because if you see this chart, where it is drawn between the relative risk of premature delivery to the length of the cervix. If the cervical length is less than 2.5 centimeter, the relative risk of premature delivery is enormously high. Whereas if the cervical length is more than 2.5 centimeter in the mid trimester, that is around 18 to 22 weeks, then the relative risk of premature delivery is relatively very, very less. And that's how the cutoff of 2.5 centimeters came into it. See, we have lots of evidences. Because of the short of time, I'm going to deal only with huge meta-analysis or a big RCTs. Just to conclude, what is the role? I'm not going to dig into smaller studies. So this was a big meta-analysis done in 2016, where around 5 RCTs were included. Here the women included were singleton pregnancy with mid-trimester sonographically short cervical length, that is less than 2.5 centimeter. So one part of the group of the women were given progesterone, the other group were given the placebo. And sorry. And if you see almost all the study at the end, and if you see this meta-analysis also includes the optimum study, which was done in 2016. And you know that, the optimum study in 2016 had changed lots of concepts on preterm labor. So including the optimum study, they all of them actually said when you supplement the women with short cervix with progesterone, the latency period is definitely increased. That is, the incidence of preterm labor is definitely reduced. So this big meta-analysis in 2016 concluded that progesterone reduces the risk of preterm birth, and hence it reduces the neonatal morbidity and mortality in women with a singleton pregnancy and mid-trimester cervical length of less than 2.5 centimeters. Further, they also recommended that all clinicians should continue to perform universal transvaginal cervical length, not transabdominal, because when you send for an anomaly scan, most of the radiologists do an abdominal ultrasound. So they also measure the cervical length transabdominally, which is causing more of false positive and false negative. So you should always, if you're not doing the scan for yourself, request your radiologist to come down to transvaginal for the cervical length. So you should perform a universal transvaginal cervical length screening at around 18 to 24 weeks of gestation in women with a singleton pregnancy. and you should offer progesterone to those with cervical length of less than 2.5 centimeters. Okay, now we'll go to the second group of people where we already know they had a history of preterm birth. Now, why this group of people are important? You see the statistics. When there is no history of any preterm, then there is only 4% risk of subsequent preterm birth. Whereas if the woman has one preterm birth previously, then her risk increases by 4 times, that is almost 17%, that she might go into again preterm birth in a subsequent pregnancy. The problem lies if she already had 2 histories of preterm birth, then there is more than 30% chance that she might have a subsequent preterm birth. So these women, by default, the first visit they come and sit in your chamber, they're going to ask you, ma'am, will I be again going to preterm this pregnancy? If so, is there any other method we can actually avoid, any medications, any surgeries? So let's see what the progesterone does in this group of people. I have also taken some oral micronized progesterone because today we are concentrating mainly on the oral progesterone. So this was an Indian study, a randomized control study done in 2011, where they supplemented 400 milligrams of progesterone daily from 16 to 34 weeks. And at the end, they saw that the group of women who were supplemented with progesterone had only 26% recurrent spontaneous preterm delivery, whereas those group who did not receive progesterone and had only placebo, more than 50%, that is 57% of them had preterm delivery in their subsequent pregnancy. And hence it was said that the micronized progesterone was associated with a trend towards reduction in the recurrent spontaneous preterm birth. Another RCT, which was again the oral micronized progesterone, was studied to see whether it will prevent recurrent spontaneous prevention of birth. Here, one group of women were supplemented with 400 milligrams of oral micronized progesterone, which was started at 14 to 18 weeks and was continued till 37 weeks of delivery. And the identical group, their placebo was given. Even in that study, it was seen that oral micronized progesterone was effective in preventing the spontaneous preterm delivery in the subsequent pregnancy. Okay, let's move on to the third group of people, that is a twin gestation. We all know that twin gestation are at increased risk of preterm delivery. There is no doubt in it. Just imagine a sequence where she has got twin gestation with short cervix. So no doubt you can blindly say that, okay, this patient is going for preterm delivery in this pregnancy. So I've taken this group of patient. I have also collected 6 RCTs, which was a big meta-analysis done in March 2017. The objective of this meta-analysis was to see whether supplementing the progesterone for prevention of preterm birth and hence reducing the neonatal morbidity and mortality in asymptomatic women with twin gestation and with sonographically short cervix. So you should see that this study was confined to twin gestation with sonographically short cervix, not just only for twin gestation. And if you see, almost 90% of the study, out of the 6 RCTs, the 5 RCTs actually favored supplementing the progesterone. And in fact, they concluded that administration of progesterone to asymptomatic women with twin gestation and sonographically short cervix in the mid-trimester reduces the risk of preterm birth occurring at less than 30 to 35 period of gestational weeks. So definitely no doubt that, again, progesterone is useful in preventing the preterm in twin gestation with short cervix, those group of people who are actually at risk for preterm delivery. Okay, now let's move on to the fourth group of people where they already had a preterm. You have successfully controlled the preterm by giving tocolysis like nifedipine and so. Now the idea is, should I give progesterone as maintenance tocolysis, whether it is going to help? So this was a double-blind randomized control study where the pregnant women at 24 to 34 weeks of singleton pregnancy were recruited after successful tocolysis with nifedipine therapy. Here, the preterm labor was defined as 4 contractions happening in 20 minutes, or if there was 8 contractions in 60 minutes, which was associated with progressive change in the cervix, or there was cervical dilatation of more than 1 centimeter, or there was cervical effacement of at least 80%. So all these women with threatened preterm labor, they received intravenous hydration therapy, that is 500 ml of intravenous ringer lactate solution. All these women received betamethasone, that is 12 milligrams intramuscularly, followed by another 12 milligrams after 24 hours. And nifedipine was the tocolysis choice. As per the protocol, all of them received initial dose of 20 milligrams, which was followed by 10 to 20 milligrams every 4 to 6 hours. So nifedipine tocolysis was continued until the uterine contraction had subsided for at least 12 hours. After the arrest of the preterm labor, patients were recruited for the study within 48 hours of acute tocolysis. Now, this arrested preterm was defined as no uterine contractions for at least 12 hours on nifedipine tocolysis. So once the arrested preterm labor was done, one group of women received 200 milligrams of oral micronized progesterone daily, and the other group just received the placebo. And at the end of this study, if you see, the mean latency period was significantly longer in the progesterone group compared with the placebo group. So what he said was the percentage of women going into preterm who received progesterone were less, that is only 15%, compared to the percentage, that is 26% of the women going into preterm who received only placebo. So this study concluded that maintenance tocolysis with oral micronized progesterone significantly prolonged pregnancy and decreased the number of preterm births. The present study also supported the use of micronized progesterone as maintenance tocolysis for prolongation of pregnancy in case of arrested preterm labor. This was another big systemic analysis and meta-analysis where 9 RCTs were taken up in 2016 to see the role of progesterone as maintenance tocolysis. Even here, the nifedipine and progesterone were used, and it was again concluded that the maintenance tocolysis with the progesterone may be useful for patients who had an episode of threatened preterm labor successfully treated with acute tocolytic therapy. So without any doubt, it was shown that progesterone can also be used as a maintenance tocolytic therapy to prevent further preterm aggravation. Okay, now the sixth topic where is what should I be doing? Should I be doing cervical encerclage or the progesterone? This is very interesting topic to me. I've did lots of research and studies on this. Before I actually tell the guidelines, let me tell what are the drawbacks with this. I went through lots of articles on cervical encerclage, but most of the articles, they don't say what type of encerclage they've been doing, whether it was McDonald's, whether it was Schrodker's, whether it was laparoscopic or interval, or it was just an emergency encerclage. Why this matters is because we all know that scientifically the internal os is the one which dilates first. The preterm, when it starts, the dilatation starts at internal os, whereas McDonald's, when you're putting a cerclage, we are actually not applying the encerclage at the level of internal os. So you might have a patient who is hardly having less than 0.5 centimeter as the posterior vaginal part of the cervix, and you just try to put the knot there only in McDonald's. So what happens is this dilatation starts at the level of internal os, so only the external os is closing. So you find a good U-shaped dilated internal os. Whereas if you're doing a Schrodker's encerclage or a laparoscopic encerclage, you're ideally going at the level of the internal os and constricting it. So technically speaking, I feel that Schrodker's or laparoscopic should be better off with the McDonald's, but we don't have sufficient RCTs to compare it. That is one thing I felt drawback, because I routinely use Shirodkars rather than McDonald's, but the problem with Shirodkars is the training is not good enough in with every gynecologist to execute it. Okay, now what does the evidence say between the progesterone and the cervical encerclage? So, vaginal progesterone versus cervical encerclage for the prevention of preterm birth in women with sonographically short cervix or singleton pregnancy and previous preterm birth. So, this was a big systemic review and meta-analysis done in 2013, and it concluded that either vaginal progesterone or cervical encerclage are equally efficacious in the prevention of preterm birth in women with short cervix or singleton pregnancy or previous preterm birth. So, this meta-analysis leaves it to the treating physician, saying that whatever you are skilled in, if you're skilled surgically, go ahead with surgical. If you're not skilled surgically, then you can always try the vaginal, the medical management. Both are equally efficacious. Later on in 2014, the RCOG also gave guidelines saying that the use of progesterone as an alternative to cervical encerclage in women with previous preterm birth or mid-trimester loss or short cervix on ultrasound. So RCOG also concurred that both are equally efficacious. Either progesterone or cervical encerclage can be used, except that RCOG put a clause and it specified two conditions where if you're suspecting those two conditions, probably cervical encerclage is better than progesterone. And those two conditions is if there was a history of PP, ROM secondary to infection, then cerclage works better than progesterone. If the patient had any cervical surgery or any cervical trauma, then encerclage works better than progesterone. Other than these other conditions, it's up to the treating physician. He can either choose for a progesterone or for a cervical encerclage. Both are equally efficacious. Okay, so now we have gone through the different scenarios where we now know that yes, preterm labor can be stopped or can be actually reduced by the use of progesterones. Now we have a cafeteria approach. We have natural progesterones, we have synthetic progesterones, and again we have oral, vaginal, intramuscular, subcutaneous creams. So which should I use and which one is actually ideal? Now let's see what is the difference between a natural progesterone and a synthetic progesterone. Now both are manufactured in the lab. Why these are called as natural micronized progesterone is because their chemical structure is exactly equivalent to the endogenous progesterone. Whereas a synthetic progesterone, their chemical structure is different from the endogenous progesterone, and hence they're called as the synthetic progesterone. Now, the commonly available synthetic progesterone is the hydroxyprogesterone caprate. I think the older gynecologists, their drug was very favorite and they used to use this drug randomly. And the another drug is the dydrogesterone. The advantage of natural micronized progesterone is they have no effect on mood, they have no effect on HDL cholesterol, they have no adverse effect on pregnancy outcomes. Whereas the synthetic progesterone definitely affects the mood, definitely decreases the HDL cholesterol level and may cause fluid retention. Now we'll see, compare one with the another one. So this was the latest FOXY recommendation with the Perinatology Committee in 2019, where they gave the guidelines comparing the natural progesterone with the synthetic progesterone, that is 17-alpha hydroxyprogesterone caprate. The key what it was noticed is the 17-alpha hydroxyprogesterone, the effect on cervical ripening is not known, whereas the natural micronized progesterone prevents cervical ripening, and hence if it can be used in primigravida, it can be used with history of preterm birth, it can be used with history of short cervical length, whereas 17-hydroxyprogesterone caprate is excellent only with history of previous preterm birth to prevent subsequent preterm delivery, whereas it has got very less effect or no effect in primigravida or patient who have short cervical length. And presently the FOXY Perinatology Committee does not recommend hydroxyprogesterone caprate for this group of women. And another worrisome is they also seen that there is increased risk of gestational diabetes when you use hydroxyprogesterone caprate. So if you're actually having an obstetric lady who already has diabetes, then probably this drug more becomes contraindicated, and probably you are left only with natural micronized progesterone. The another oral synthetic progesterone what is available is the dydrogesterone. Now, if you see the FDA category, it is either category A or the category B, the natural micronized progesterone. When I say category A or B, that means that the incidence of fetal abnormalities are same in patients who took or who do not take this progesterone. That means they are not teratogen and they are the safe drug, and they have been recommended by many international guidelines for the prevention of preterm labor. Whereas in contrast, dydrogesterone, the American US FDA does not categorize dydrogesterone, whereas the Australian FDA categorizes it to a category D drug because it was seen there was 3 times higher risk of congenital heart defects in infants of the mother exposed to dydrogesterone during early pregnancy. And there are also not sufficient studies of the use of dydrogesterone in preterm labor. So this was an excellent study done in Maccabi Medical Center in Israel, and it was released in 2019, where the data of 17 years was collected, and almost more than 8,000 children were studied who were exposed to dydrogesterone in the first trimester, and more than 5,000 babies were male and more than 4,000 babies were female. And this group was excluded. Those people who underwent IVF or ART were excluded from the study because they didn't want it to be biased for any IVF related drugs. And very shockingly, it was seen that there was increased risk of hydrocephalus, spina bifida, cardiovascular malformation, and hypospadiasis in the infants who were exposed to dydrogesterone in the first trimester of pregnancy. Okay, so now you know what progesterone to be used. Now let's move on whether what route should be used. We have oral route, vaginal route, intramuscular route, subcutaneous route, and rectal route. Now by default, if I ask all of you, like, your group of patients, what route are they preferable? Without doubt, we say, no, all my patients prefer oral. Now, we all been using vaginal progesterone for quite a long time, but see, most of my patients, and I think your patients, they come back and they say, ma'am, every time I keep the tablet, I have white discharge. I don't know why. I've been getting recurrent UTI, or I've been getting recurrent itching all over the vulval region. The reason is because when they keep that capsule, they don't push it deep inside the vagina. Whatever you tell them, place it deep inside. Psychologically, since it's a precious pregnancy, they think putting the finger deep inside the vagina, they might poke the baby, they might cause preterm. So they place it very superficially. And when the drug liquefies, it just comes out, most of the drug, and it keeps that part wet. So the drug coming out, they feel it is white discharge. The part becomes wet, so there's a itching happening over there, fungal infection coming out there. So most of the patients are definitely compliant with the oral route. But unfortunately, what was happening was the same vaginal capsule, when it was given orally, it used to get metabolized in the small intestine, and the metabolite, that is the pregnenolone, used to cause severe side effects like, dizziness, vomiting, laziness. No doubt, most of the husbands used to come and say, after my wife takes this drug, she's always sleeping, she is little irritated, she doesn't want to do any work, she is nauseating. That was because we had converted the vaginal capsule into a oral tablet. But now with the invent of oral natural micronized sustained release, the modification what was done is the absorption in the intestine is limited, so that the majority of the drug is not metabolized at the first part of the intestine. So the side effects are very minimal. Second, they're mainly absorbed by the lymphatic system, and hence they bypass the first pass metabolism, and then again the metabolite is reduced. So because of this, the sedation or the dizziness is reduced and the absorption is delayed. So their action is also staying for 18, half-life is almost for 18 hours. So the invent of this sustained release oral micronized progesterone, which releases small amount of progesterone in the upper GIT, where metabolism is high, and due to minimization of the metabolism, sedation and dizziness is less and has a better compliance. And since it is sustained release, it can also be given once daily dosage by giving the patient convenience. Okay. But since the oral formulations are new to the industry, we are always skeptical, like, because we have been using vaginal progesterone, we have been using injectable progesterone. And now a big Cochrane has come up saying that which route is better. You use oral route, you use vaginal route, you use injectable route, all of them give equal success. But what is more important for you is to maintain the serum progesterone level at a threshold. Now, if you see in the luteal phase, the mean threshold level of serum progesterone should be more than 14. In the luteal phase, if the serum progesterone level is more than 14 nanogram, then the pregnancy will continue. If it is less than 14 nanogram, then she will invariably have abortions or luteal phase defect. So imagine if you're supplementing an oral sustained release tablet of 300 milligrams once daily, then if you see the mean concentration is 36, almost double it. So it is sufficient. You're giving a vaginal capsule, it's around 19 to 18 nanograms per ml. If you're giving an injectable progesterone, it's around 90 nanogram per ml. So basically, if you can maintain that threshold, then the pregnancy will continue. It doesn't matter which route you are actually giving the drug. Now, why again this is important is because I, being an ART consultant and IVF specialist, I sometimes see some patients get referred. They've been put on vaginal progesterones, oral progesterones, injectable progesterones, and probably once in 15 days depot injections of progesterones, defosterones. And I do a serum progesterone for these people. It is somewhere at around 200 or 250 nanograms. So no need to supplement so much, because we all know that on the other way, when we know there are so many advantages, we also know that progesterone can also have side effects, mainly the thrombosis part. So we don't want that to happen. So supplement progesterone sufficient enough to keep the serum progesterone of more than 14. That can be achieved by any one of the routes. And this was again the recent perinatology update in 2018 to see whether the different routes of administration of progesterone, there is any difference. And in the end of the study, it said that there is no difference in the route of administration. In fact, it also said that the oral natural micronized sustained release formulations may have a better compliance of the patients, but still more Indian studies will be needed. Okay, so now we know the progesterone, which progesterone to use, which route to use. Now, I'll just want to summarize what are the international guidelines telling about the role of progesterones on the prevention of preterm delivery. So I have taken the European guidelines in 2017, the Australian guidelines in 2017, the French guidelines, NICE guidelines, FIGO guidelines, the RCOG guidelines, ACOG guidelines, the SOGC guidelines, probably, almost the top guidelines for the recommendation. And if you see, all of them actually talk the same thing. So instead of going on each and everything, I will concise you what these guidelines are talking. To summarize these guidelines, what they tell is sonographically cervical length measurement is recommended. That is, transvaginal cervical length measurement is recommended in all pregnant patients, regardless of their obstetric history at around 18 to 23 weeks of gestation, using transvaginal ultrasound. Asymptomatic women with sonographically short cervix, that is less than 2.5 centimeters at mid gestation, there can be a singleton pregnancy or a twin pregnancy. They can have previous obstetrics bad history or a previous history of preterm. All of them should be offered with progesterone treatment for the prevention of preterm birth. and hence to reduce the neonatal morbidity and mortality. So to summarize my talk for today, probably the take-home points: all pregnancies should be considered at some risk for preterm labor. At the time of anomaly scan, please ask for a cervical length. Consider progesterone when the cervical length is less than 2.5 centimeters. All previous preterm delivery carry the risk of recurrence, and hence definitely consider progesterone supplementation. All twin gestation carry increased risk of preterm, particularly when the cervical length is less than 2.5 centimeter at 18 to 24 weeks. Recommend them giving progesterone supplementation. When you have achieved a tocolysis with preterm labor, consider using progesterone as maintenance tocolysis. When expertise is available, plan for a cervical encerclage. But when in doubt, progesterone is definitely an acceptable alternative. Thank you very much for your patient listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashok. Indeed, it was a very elaborative talk, and you presented from the basics till to the evidence. Every point of the preterm labor have been covered in depth. It was really a good talk.
Hello.
And we have very few
Hello.
questions. I think ma'am wants to have some word on this. Pramila ma'am, would you,
Hello,
you want to say?
Susma. I just want to say that I'm very happy to see Ashok, and being a teacher to introduce our student is very, very happy for the teacher. Okay, Ashok, it's a nice talk and very informative. Now over to Sushma.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, the first question is role of which is the antibiotic of choice for preterm labor?
No, there is no role for actually giving prophylactically, but yes, if you're suspecting and if you want to give till the reports are available, your swab cultures, probably you can start them on erythromycin 250 milligrams QAD. That is the one which is being routinely given. And can I also say hi to Dr. Suma ma'am? I think Suma ma'am is here. She was one of our favorite. Hi, Suma.
We are happy that while discussing when I had a discussion with Dr. Ashok regarding our webinar, it was very happy that we could converse in Kannada and
exactly. Kannada
know that you had your education in Mysore. Very happy, and it's proud to have you here.
The moment they told me Mysore, I jumped and said yes.
What's the role of progesterone in the after cerclage procedure? Do you want to continue probably, or
No.
is the cerclage only enough?
See, that's what is you have according to the guidelines. When I talk, it's either cerclage or progesterone. But yes, the apprehension of the patient is there. So practically, when we go ahead, yes, we do supplement them after progesterone, after cerclage, we do give them some amount of progesterone up to 34 weeks. But what I want to stress here is, but don't overload them. Like, if you're giving vaginal, give vaginal. If you're giving oral, give oral. I see many people receiving injectable also, oral also, or vaginal also. That is not needed. Hi, Vidya Bhatt ma'am.
Hi. Nice to see all of you.
Yes, ma'am. I think Sushma ma'am's net is little stuck.
Yeah, I think there's an issue with her.
I think there's an issue with her.
Yes.
But I cannot see any question.
Hi, Vidya ma'am.
Hi, Vidya. Hi, ma'am. Hi, ma'am. Hi, Dr. Pramila.
Hello.
Nice to see you, madam.
Hello, nice to see you, Vidya.
Hi, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Ashok.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you.
Really nice to have you in our forum. It was really a pleasure. Thank you. We move on to the next topic. The topic is on medical management of endometriosis. And we have for this the very distinguished and dynamic faculty, Dr. Vidya Bhatt. She needs no introduction. She is the most dynamic personality in Karnataka OB-GYN Society. I'm really privileged to be having worked under her and done my fellowship with her guidance. And to introduce ma'am, Madam is medical director at Radhakrishna Multi-Speciality Hospital and IVF Center, Bangalore, and she's conducted more than 100 live demonstrations and laparoscopic surgeries. And all over India, she was the first woman gynec endoscopic surgeon from Karnataka to do live demonstrations. And she's been the invited faculty at international level conferences. And she's been conducting the Endovision conference every year, which is focused on the skill development and recent advances. She's contributed over 32 publications in national and international journals, and she's presented more than 100 papers in the international and national conferences. And she's been awarded from the Economic Times, the best endoscopic surgeon, South India in 2019, and the best paper in IUG. And she's been awarded best paper in ASUOG 2019, the CS Dawn Prize for Endoscopy. And she's been, her center is the RUHS recognized training center for the reproductive medicines and minimal invasive surgery, the endoscopy. And she's conducted FOXI and ICOG recognized laparoscopy, hysteroscopy courses. And she's trained more than 500 students and also international students as well. And we are really happy to have you, ma'am. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Sushma, for the very nice introduction. And thank you, Mysore Society, Dr. Parimala ma'am, Sushma, and everybody there for giving me this opportunity. It is very nice feel to come to Mysore or address the Mysore Society, because I've got a lot of emotional attachments in Mysore. Every time I look forward to come to Mysore, the beautiful city and one of the cleanest cities in our country. And I really like the Mysore Society. I have very fond memories of the Kasoga which we conducted in Mysore. Probably it was 2016 if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 2016 I think, which was really nice, and it was so nice coming and interacting with you all, and that was one of the best conferences of Kasoga. I think there is an echo in my voice. If the backup team or the Sun Pharma could do something, the technical team, that would be really nice. Now, talking about the medical management of endometriosis, whenever we say medical management of endometriosis, the first question which arises is, does it really work? Well, it does work at some places. We have to individualize. It is not that one dress will fit for everybody. You have to tailor make each case for each person. The medical management and the surgical management is different. So you can't just sort of say, okay, everybody, we are going to give this. No, you can't just come to a conclusion and say, I'm going to start this for somebody. Before you start a medical management, you have to analyze the stage, the clinical features, the infertility status or the pain status of the patient, and then go ahead with the medical management. So all of us know that endometriosis is an enigmatic disease. Yes, infertility and pain is something common, and recurrence is even more common. So types of endometriosis, we talk generally about the peritoneal, ovarian, and deep infiltrating. Then, of course, all the different extra pelvic endometriosis, which is quite rare, but when it comes, that has to be tackled efficiently. Now, why is this endometriosis so complicated? It is genetically inherited, which some say that it is in the gene. The function of the cells are the stem cells which come out are this endometriosis specialty cells are there. And then there is distorted pelvic anatomy, altered peritoneal function because of the inflammatory response, altered hormonal and cell-mediated function, endocrine and ovulatory abnormality, impaired implantation, oocyte and embryo quality is at stake, and abnormal uterotubal transport. Now, the surgical management, well, we will see where we should do the surgical management. But when I say medical therapies, we have a array of different drugs. Now, when we come to these drugs, which drug do we give is the question. Do we give a specific therapy? Do we give a palliative kind of treatment, or do we give something like a placebo? So what are the medical therapies? The surgical and medical therapies, they definitely sometimes fail. Combination is required, which gives the best outcome. I think there is enough and more evidence for that. And fertility improvement with medical therapy, though there is no evidence, there is evidence that 6 months before ART, you give medical therapy, the fertility, I mean, the implantation rate is better. Then selection of the drug has to be depending upon the cost and patient compliance and rationale to induce amenorrhea, and depending upon the estrogenic status. All that has to be seen, as I told you before. Fertility treatments should inhibit ovulation, or there should be suppression of ovulation and even the periods, and the side effects sometimes may be really grave. So we have to look at that also. And the symptoms can recover after completion of therapy. So when I say medical therapy, we say hormonal, which is the first one, combined OC pills, estrogen containing contraceptive devices like oral and injectable, implants, then LNG, IUGS. Though implants is not popular in our country, or it's not yet really come, but LNG, IUGS, selective progesterone receptor modulators, mifepristone, ulipristal acetate, and anapristone. These are some of the drugs which we think about. And then, of course, the GnRH releasing hormone agonists, that is leupride acetate, then this nafrelin, goserelin, gonadotrophic releasing hormone antagonists, that is cetrorelix. Non-hormonal, you have NSAIDs, aromatase inhibitors, and danazol. Now, how this medical therapy acts? See, we have to understand that there are 3-4 concepts in the management of endometriosis. What happens? There is inflammation because of the implants. So we need some drug to act at the estrogen receptors, and they decrease the estrogen, I mean, the endometrial implants in the peritoneum or inside the uterus or into the myometrium. So that is one thing. Second thing is, we have inflammation. So we, as I told you before, so we want the inflammation to be reduced. And third important thing is the angiogenesis. There is increased vascularization, neovascularization. So this angiogenesis leads to more and more inflammation, more and more hemorrhage there, and that causes adhesions, and that is the pathology which gives you a TO mass or a completely frozen pelvis in endometriosis. So you want a drug like GnRH antagonists, aromatase inhibitors, and some, all this, they act at the estrogen receptors. They prevent the cell proliferation and differentiation, immune function and inflammation, and they also prevent to some extent retrograde menstruation because of amenorrhea. Then you have the estrogen and progesterone receptors. This invasion and angiogenesis, that also has to be prevented. So these NSAID, antioxidants, then thiazolidinones, then cannabinoid agonists, and then vitamins, all this prevent this angiogenesis. Then you have the statins and botanical extracts. There is apoptosis also. So that has to be, I mean, it should cause, instead of proliferation, it should cause apoptosis. So for that, you need these statins. Then you have the progesterones and SPRM, and then the estrogen receptor suppressors. So angiogenesis in the pathogenesis of endometriosis. So what is this? This is the pathway, you know, that it causes from the bone marrow cell, the EPC cells, which cause the adhesion, angiogenesis, peritoneal invasion. So this is released. So then there is endometriotic implants. So this causes a pro-angiogenic factor and neovascularization. And this causes adhesion in the peritoneal cavity. So these pro-angiogenic factors are all this VGEF and tumor necrosis factor, erythropoietin, angiogenin, and all this. So then for the inflammatory response, you have the endometrial cell and the peritoneal cavity, in the peritoneal cavity, which causes the inflammatory response. And then there is hypoxia, endothelium injury, inflammation, then the receptor expression, and all this causes the angiogenesis in the peritoneum, which leads to neovascularization, and then it causes the adhesion formation because of inflammation. So clinicians are recommended to prescribe hormonal treatment, that is contraceptives with level B evidence, progestogens at level A evidence, anti-progestogens at level A, or GnRH agonists also level A evidence. So as it reduces endometriosis and pain. So danazol, this is one of the most ancient drug which came in the management of endometriosis. And what we saw there was that it inhibits the FSH and LH surges, prevents steroidogenesis in corpus luteum. But the side effects were really high. Though danazol was used right and left at one time, now people have stopped using danazol because of its side effects. Then you have the aromatase inhibitors. How does this act? Aromatase inhibitors inhibit the local estrogen production in endometriotic implants and as well as ovary, brain, adipose tissue. So they significantly reduce endometriosis associated with pain as compared with GnRH agonists alone. And endometriotic implants express aromatase and consequently generate estrogen, maintaining own viability. So the dosage of these aromatase inhibitors like anastrozole or letrozole is 1 milligram or 2.5. So this is given also in combination with progesterones and OC pills, so that the intensity of pain and to some extent it may help infertility, but the pain when the patients are symptomatic, it helps them. Then the others, you have the estrogen, the estrogen progesterone combinations you have, then the biphosphonates, then tibolone. All this are like an add-back therapy when you give with the for your endometriotic oral oral therapy or medical therapy management. Then of course we give oral contraceptives. So this is well tolerated. It relieves dysmenorrhea, and ovarian suppression is there, and often simple, effective, and the side effects are really less. And because you're avoiding periods, the retrograde menstruation and all those problems can come down. Then progestogens, it inhibits growth of lesions, inducing destigmatization, followed by atrophy. So whenever you give progestogens for a long time, even when you give the medroxyprogesterone acetate or Depo-Provera, you see the endometrium just thinning out. Whenever there is hyperplastic endometrium, we normally give progestogens to thin out that. So these are given either injectables or oral, and by thinning out the endometrium, it acts, and the side effects are not that severe. Though there is a little fluid retention, depression, and weight gain, it gives a much better relief as compared to the other issues. And Mirena, of course, is now introduced into the uterine cavity, and this has a lot of relief in adenomyosis, and of course even to some extent in endometriosis also. The other progestogens given are the MPA, DMPA, norethistron, dydrogesterone, and Dynogest. Dynogest, of course, which is popularly known as Visan, is also given these days, and this gives a lot of relief to patients, and it is also called as the wonder drug, the 4th generation selective progestogen. And mode of action is anovulation, anti-proliferation, inhibition of cytokine secretion from the endometrial glands. Additional effects is anti-androgenic, so profound local effects on the local endometriotic implants. And oral absorption is rapid, and good bioavailability is there. And mild to moderate symptoms could be there. There could be headache, and then discomfort, and mood swings, and nausea, vomiting. Then, of course, you want something anti-inflammatory. So you can give non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, but this is basically to prevent dysmenorrhea, and this depends on the cost and availability of what anti-inflammatory drugs the patient can tolerate. Then, of course, GnRH releasing hormone agonists. Now, this is given right and left. Sometimes I see patients coming with 3 or 4 doses. Yes, it is effective, but we should always keep in mind it does not act on bigger cysts, and it does not act when there is severe pain and infertility improvement. I mean, the fertility status will not improve. So it produces hypogonadotropic hypogonadism, that kind of picture, and it is effective as medical therapies in pain relieving and reducing progression. That is what I said. If it is mild symptoms, it is reduced, but if it is very severe, then it is not reduced. Then disadvantages include, as I told you before, the cost. We have to think about the cost. And second thing is there is bone mineral density loss, and the side effects are intolerable, and there is hot flushes, hair loss, and sometimes the patient really comes with depression. So it's better we don't give for a prolonged period of, sometimes I see them give for 1 year. So that should not be done. Even if you are giving, give them a break and then give. So that can be a better therapy for these patients. So administration of GnRH agonist is initial pituitary flare is there. It may exacerbate the endometriosis symptoms and can be blunted by after 7 to 10 days. So always tell your patient that it will take some time for anything to come down. So the moment you give a shot of injection, that doesn't mean that the patient will be immediately relieved with symptoms. So downregulation of pituitary receptors and decrease in FSH and LH, ovarian suppression, and then acts directly on the endometriotic implants. Though it is good, it can be given, but you have to really select the patients and give. Don't just give it for a long period. So then, of course, the side effects, as I said, ADVAC therapy, what you need is, for the side effects, you may have to give some tablets. Sometimes you may have to give only progesterone or a combination of estrogen progesterone post usage of this GnRH. And also it must be, the patient has to take calcium, and it cannot be used with, I mean, long term, as I told you, it cannot be used, but you may have to give some other ACT therapy for all the side effects which are there. And alternatively, GnRH agonists may be reduced, or interval between the doses may be increased. So as I told you, you should not give for a long time. The types of the agonists are leuprorelin, goserelin, triptorelin, buserelin, and naferelin. So all these are depending upon the cost and the comfort of the patient, you can give this. But basically, it depends upon the case which you are dealing with. So then you have this selective progesterone receptor modulators. So these agents have a tissue effect ranging from pure agonist to agonist bar antagonist to antagonist. So you have this mifepristone, ulipristonol acetate. Many people have given that, and they have found that there is atrophy of the endometrium and selective inhibition of endometrial growth without the side effects of hypoestrogenism and decreased menstrual bleeding and effect on endometrial blood supply suppression. All this, I mean, this may not be much when you compare it with the other drugs. Then you have these future therapies, the anti-angiogenesis factor, statins, then the tumor necrosis factor alpha blockers, then the PPAR gamma blocker, and pentoxifylline. So all these are different drugs which are at the experimental level, and in future they are at the animal studies, and in future maybe they will be used routinely. However, they are found to be good in animal models, and they may be thought, to give them for endometriosis in selective cases, or studies have to come to prove that these cause a very good effect on these endometriotic implants in future. Then, of course, anti-angiogenic agents, as I told you, dopamine and dopamine agonists, that is bromocriptine and cabergoline, are able to promote the VEGFR to endocytosis in the endometrial cells, blocking critical step in the neoangiogenesis process and reducing the expression of VGEF in the ectopic endometrium. This is a little complicated to understand, but basically what we have to understand is that it controls the vascular endothelial growth factor receptors, and that's where it prevents the neoangiogenesis. So when this prevents neoangiogenesis, the inflammation comes down, because as and when you have newer vessels, there is inflammation, and the peritoneal inflammatory cells and adhesion formation becomes less. So this is the gist of understanding the mechanism of anti-angiogenic drugs used in endometriosis. So cabergoline in endometriosis, cabergoline endocytosis of VGEF, it acts on the endocytosis of the VGEFR2 receptors, reduces neoangiogenesis, prevents the VGEF to VGEFR2 binding, and shrinkage of the endometrioma. So it is known to, even if there is endometrioma, to some extent it is known to shrink it. So it is also called as the poor man's treatment for endometriosis. So doses help in decreasing the endometrioma size as compared to our agonist. So the prospective randomized studies, which was done in 140 patients, group 1 had cabergoline and group 2 had the LHRH, that is the GnRH agonist. And then it was seen that this dose is 0.5 mg twice weekly, and it is more effective than the agonist in decreasing the endometrioma size more than 25% of the original size. Well, if you have a patient of recurrence with endometrioma, there is a good, she's been operated before, and then you see the endometrioma coming again after 3 or 4 years she comes, it is worthwhile to give this drug because it decreases to 25, more than 25%. So once it decreases, you can see the other follicles and then stimulate that patient, and then pick the do the OM pickup, and then after that, if necessary, you can do the surgery. Because when there is a recurrence of this endometrioma and we try to stimulate or go and do the surgery, the ovarian reserve just goes down even more, and there are chances that we may not get her good quality eggs. Instead, we can stimulate her, then let the endometrioma decrease, give her cabergoline, then let the endometrioma decrease in size, and then stimulate her. And after you do the OM pickup, before the embryo transfer, if at all, you can give a higher medical therapy or do the surgery, so that the ovarian reserve is maintained and the conception rate also increases. Because whenever there is a endometrioma and you happen to do the OM pickup, there are high chances of infection is there. So we have to see to it that we have to balance between the two, whether we do a medical therapy and then do a surgical therapy or do a combined. So all this depends upon the fertility status, the age, the AMH levels, and the number of surgeries the patient has undergone. So in the present day era, it should be 1 or maximum 2 surgeries. Within that period, the patient has to conceive. So that should be our aim when we treat our patients with endometriosis. So the side effects in both the groups were not much. So this guideline recommendation is included in FOXI recommendation on the endometriosis management. So cabergoline 0.5 mg twice weekly for 3 months. And the study highlights the potential role of cabergoline to target neoangiogenesis in endometriosis. So it is the role of cabergoline to target the neoangiogenesis in endometriosis. So it is safe and effective. Dopamine agonist causes endocytosis, as I told you before, and it reduces the neoangiogenesis. It ensure exposure to cabergoline was associated with decreased number of active lesions, lowered cellularity, and a significantly less developed vascularization. Stimulation by cabergoline was associated with reduced phosphorylation of VGE FR2 to reduce gene and protein expression and vascular endothelial growth factor, and increased level of angiogenetic markers. So then we come to the statins. So these are basically the these they decrease the anti-inflammatory and anti-angiogenic response, and they have their antioxidant property. So we have many drugs with them, but nothing has been proved. It is basically on the animal models. So this is another TNF alpha blocker. This is also very popular in animal models, and this further studies are required to see its future in the management of endometriosis, but probably in future it will come. Then the PPAR, this is also another ligand activator nuclear receptor, was suggested in the role of inflammation and lipid and glucose metabolism. So this is also known to have anti-inflammatory properties and reduce estrogen biosynthesis by inhibiting the aromatase enzyme. So this is very prominent in the, it is used in the animal models, and they have seen that the results are good. Next is the pentoxifylline. So it also has the TNF alpha blocking properties, suppressing the release of inflammatory mediators. So this is another agent that has been lately studied in the treatment of endometriosis. And of course, it is used in claudications. It helps in improving the vascular supply in stenotic arteries by inhibiting the phosphatidylesterases enzyme. So human studies are limited, but definitely we will look forward in future to have such a drug in the management of endometriosis. So these are the different drugs when there is dysmenorrhea, basically pain. When the patient has pain, then we have to try all sorts of drugs which are present in our armamentarium of medications. So the oral anti-gonadotropic agents have been shown to have shown its significance with effect in future. That is nothing but the elagolix. Like I think this was the question asked in the previous Rajiv Gandhi exams last year, and many people did not know about this, but I'm sure now everybody will know about this. So elagolix is a second generation short acting oral GnRH antagonist that was recently developed to address both safety and efficacy in the management of endometriosis related. Whenever there is pain, this is related, this is given, and it is in phase 3 of the clinical trial. The effects of elagolix on the hypothalamo-pituitary axis appears to be dose dependent, results in partial suppression of ovarian function with lower doses and full ovarian suppression with higher doses. They arrest the progression of the disease and dramatically reduce pain, and the pain relief is very fast and significant. So maybe this will be our future drug in the management of pain in endometriosis. The ability to control the extent of ovarian suppression may improve the side effect profile of this medication while maintaining the efficacy of endometriosis treatment. So even though there could be some side effects, this may see the future because this may become popular. The new clinical trials for similar drugs are ongoing. In publication of reference, elagolix compared with the placebo showed significant decrease from the baseline in the mean pain score. Additionally, at low doses of 150 mg daily, elagolix does not suppress ovulation, resulting in an annual pregnancy rate of 5%. So if you're giving for somebody saying that placebo, okay, you've undergone surgery, but still you have pain, we want you to take this tablet. So she may ovulate in between, and she can conceive, and that there is no evidence of any teratogenicity. So this may be a future drug. Then of course there are many alternative therapies, Chinese drugs, and then there may be some powders, then dopamine agonists, as I told you before, and some cyclooxygenase inhibitor. So all these are basically to give some placebo one, and then we say, okay, this is the new treatment in the management of endometriosis, but nothing has been proved to be effective so far. You have a patient like this. It is stage 4 endometriotic cyst clearance. she comes, actually this patient had undergone a clearing before, and then she was lost for follow-up, and I had advised her that time only to come for IVF because of her bad endometriosis, some about 10 or 12 years back. Then she lost for follow-up, and then she didn't even take medications, and then she came back with severe pain and this kind of picture. So now tackling this is the biggest challenge, because first is you can't see the what is happening, and then you realize that there is so much of bowel adhesions and omental adhesions. This is the biggest challenge in endometriosis. We see bowel adhesions, we see a deep infiltrating endometriosis. So many a times we need help from our colleagues also, like surgeons and GI surgeons and urologists, where we may have to do even ureteric dissections. Ureteric dissections and stenting, all those heroics should be done only if there is hydroureters in endometriosis. And then if necessary, you have to do the ureteric implant. Unnecessarily, routinely don't go and do all these heroic surgeries, because these are young patients and we can't just put them on problems or get them into a bad phase by doing all these things. Our surgery should not cause problems to their quality of life. So here I did the cyst aspiration after separation, and then we did the cystectomy, and then you can see so much of bowel adhesions. And then there's some amount of deep infiltrating endometriosis also. So there is bowel adhesion. So whenever there is bowel adhesion and sigmoid colon adhesion, the trick is go from the clean area. So now the main endometriotic problem is taken care, and then identify the lateral pelvic wall, identify the ureter. And once you identify the ureter, you know that there is no issue with your ureter, and ureter is not, there is no ureteric endometriosis. Then you go on excising, and the next challenge is the moment you release the lateral pelvic wall, the bowel just falls back. That is, the sigmoid colon just falls back, and you are able to separate the sigmoid colon. And once you separate that, they may be bleeding, and try not to use energy source as far as possible. Try to use sutures, because sutures can do wonders, and they can prevent complications. And then of course do a proper cystectomy, clearing, and then see there is separation of deep infiltrating endometriosis. So separate that, and then later we have planning for IVF for that patient. Is that the other video? One second, I'll show you another video which we have been trying to give medical therapy, but this lady did not respond to any kind of medical therapy. It was done recently, so I have not edited the video, but I'll show you that she had severe pain. It was like a bomb in her pelvis, adenomyoma sitting. Now, when you have an adenomyoma, we tend to do all sorts of medications, and then we also put in the Mirena. But in her case, even the Mirena didn't work. So what we did was we did this adenomyomectomy. Now, when fertility is not the concern, when it is pain, as far as possible, we should try to avoid surgery. But look at this. This is the adenomyoma sitting in the posterior wall of the uterus. You give vasopressin and make an incision, and then see how close to the cavity it is. Now here we are separating the adenomyoma. You can see me using the harmonic and separating the adenomyoma. Now adenomyoma separation is done by coring. That is, you keep about 0.5 or 1 centimeter, and then you separate the adenomyoma and remove the adenomyoma as a whole. So you can see me completely separating it here. It is coming out as a nodule. So go to the lateral wall, try to identify the normal tissue, because it is a part of the myometrium. So try invading the myometrium, and then you do this debulking surgery. So posteriorly, this gets separated. Posteriorly, start coring again, and see you can separate the adenomyoma, and it gets separated easily when your planes are well established. And don't sacrifice the serosa, or don't sacrifice the outer myometrium, but take the inner adenomyoma. For this, you should have a proper mapping of the adenomyoma. Get an MRI done, or even if you can do your own transvaginal scans, please do the transvaginal scans and then remove the adenomyoma. See, you can see that it's been getting completely separated. It's coming out. So this gives a lot of relief to the patient. Then you can do your medical management. So I'll just show you how then anteriorly also there was a small piece. So what we did was we removed that, and then go to the one more. Next one. Anteriorly also we separated, and then go to the suturing. And once you finish this, you have to retain the endometrium. See, in future, if the patient comes and says, no, I want a pregnancy, so you should retain the endometrium. So the dead space between the endometrial wall and the myometrium was closed initially. And then we closed the uterine musculature, and see, the uterus was reconstructed, and you can see all those adenomyoma pieces which we have removed. And then, and once we finished removal, then we separated the posterior wall, and suturing has to be really good here. It is a little difficult to suture because of the tough tissue of the myometrium, because of the adenomyosis. But barbed sutures have made a real, it's a boon in the management of myomectomy and adenomyosis. So respect the cavity, save the cavity, and then close it in proper layers, and see to it you don't obliterate anything. And this is the final picture of the uterine reconstruction. Then finally we put oxidized regenerated cellulose, that is Interseed, and then we came out. See, this is the final picture of the adenomyomectomy. And after, please don't do a scan immediately. Do a scan once it is about 3 months post-surgery. You see a very nice outcome, and whatever endometriotic spots were there, that was coagulated, and the adhesions were released. Let's go back to the first slide. Go back to that. This, we put it in an endo bag, and don't remove from the ports. Okay, just put it in an endo bag and remove, because you may get scar endometriosis. So that is very important. Next. Interseed was put up. Then just go to the slides. I'll just go back to my slides now. Sorry, I didn't have time to edit that, but I thought I must show you that there are some situations where medical therapy does not work. So please don't keep on giving medical therapy. And whenever it is necessary, whenever you have deep infiltrating endometriosis, that was another video I wanted to do, but because of the shortage of time, I did not put that video. Whenever there is deep infiltrating endometriosis, DIE, please do not try any medications. It is only surgery. And when there is rectal involvement, you should see whether there is rectal involvement and then treat that. So endometriosis is a chronic, but it's a costly disease requiring long-term multidisciplinary approach. Profound personal and economic impact underscores the urgent need for continued research and improvement in the diagnostic and treatment modalities. Timely intervention and appropriate multifactorial treatment may restore the quality of life, preserve or improve fertility, and lead to long-term effective management in the absence of a permanent cure. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I'm requesting all of you, thank you all from the Mysore Society for voting for me and sending me to IAGE Managing Committee. But I'm requesting all of you to become IAGE and KIAGE members. Please improve your endoscopic skills. There are a lot of benefits when you become a IAGE. Now it is through KIAGE. You know that there is KIAGE, Karnataka Association of IAGE. And please become members. And only when you become members, I will know that you have endoscopic skills, and I will be able to give you opportunity from our committee and then send you to the national levels. So looking forward in future to all of you becoming members. Thank you, Mysore Society, again for giving me this opportunity. and Sun Pharma. Thank you, Sun Pharma, for this opportunity.
Hello.
Yes, madam. You can hear you.
Hello, Sushma.
Ma'am, please go ahead. We can hear you.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello.
Ma'am, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
I thank all the speakers, Sushma, and I want you to give vote of thanks to close the session.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. We have a few more questions before we wind up Dr. Vidya. One of the questions is like, how long to give medical management?
Now, once
How-
again, yeah. See, that's $1 million question, I'll tell you. That basically depends on the symptoms. Suppose the lady is having pain and her endometriotic lesions you see is very small when you do a scan. I would suggest in such cases you can give a long-term medical therapy, give them for 3 to 6 months, and if her symptom comes down, insert a Mirena, and once you insert the Mirena, to some extent the lesions would have decreased in size, and in case in future she gets pain, you can start the therapy again. But whenever you start off a medical therapy or even an add-back therapy, you have to give at least minimum of 3 to 6 months for pain. And if the patient is infertile and you have done a surgery, by the time the patient recoups and you plan for a IUI or an IVF, at least 1 or 2 months of medical therapy would really make a lot of difference in these patients.
One more, in adolescent endometriosis, when to plan surgical management?
Yeah, this is once again is really a dicey situation. But if the adolescent girl is symptomatic, that is, you see an endometriotic cyst in her, and the girl is really suffering from pain, it is said that by the time the adolescent girls reach a gynecologist, her disease would have advanced. Because what happens is, it is monthly dysmenorrhea, she goes to a local GP, and then she's been, even to refer to a scan, it takes some time. But if she comes with a full-blown disease of endometriosis, it is better we clear the endometriosis and put her on a long-term medical therapy so that we can prevent recurrence in her. So the first surgery, whatever we do, has to be the best surgery. And now this is an era of ovarian tissue cryopreservation. So we have to also offer ovarian tissue cryopreservation in these patients. And maybe the future is ovarian tissue cryopreservation, because whenever we see adolescent girls and their ovarian status or endometriomas are getting compromised, so we have to offer it to them. So future is ovarian tissue cryopreservation.
Thank you, ma'am. It was really enjoyable to have you, and very importantly to see you after a long time.
Same here,
It's indeed a pleasure. Hope I see you again in soon.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to come to MISO after the pandemic.
Yeah.
And please tell everybody to become IAG members, because I'm planning a lot for our members. So maybe we can, the youngsters who are all doing work in their own centers can be in future put to the national level, which I think, how long can we keep on operating? Can we show live demonstration? We want youngsters also to come. So that is my future. And I am for young talent promotion.
Yeah, ma'am. I'm there to follow your footsteps. Thank you, ma'am. With the permission of our president and our team members, I take this opportunity to thank all the speakers, Dr. Vidya Bhatt, Dr. Ashok Kumar, and also Dr. Sri Harsha. All the topics and all the discussions have been very beautifully presented, and very importantly, very informative to all of us. And I think many people from other societies also have logged in. And thank you, all the speakers and all the members of the Mysore Society, and definitely the team of Sun Pharma, who have taken so much of effort to organize this webinar. And we thank from the Mysore Society, the team of Sun Pharma, and thank you one and all for joining us for this webinar. Thank you.
So much.
Thank you one and all. Thank you.